General Kexthara's mandibles clicked nervously as he adjusted his position on the crystal dais. The War Council of the Zephyrian Empire stretched before him in concentric circles, hundreds of the galaxy's most experienced military minds waiting for his report. Their bioluminescent crests pulsed with various colors of anticipation, curiosity, and barely concealed impatience. "Honored commanders," Kexthara began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of conquest. "What I am about to share will challenge everything we believe about warfare, about our superiority, and about our place in this galaxy." High Commander Veltran's crest flashed orange with annoyance. "General, we have heard whispers of your difficulties with the third planet of the Sol system. Surely you exaggerate. The species barely achieved faster-than-light travel a century ago. Our intelligence reports showed primitive chemical projectile weapons and crude nuclear devices." Kexthara's 3 eyes focused on Veltran with an intensity that made the High Commander's luminescence dim. "That intelligence, honored sir, nearly cost us everything. It nearly destroyed the Fifth Fleet, and it has forced me to recommend something I never thought I would suggest in my lifetime of service." A ripple of confusion passed through the chamber. The Fifth Fleet was one of their most powerful battle groups, equipped with the latest plasma weaponry and defended by energy shields that could withstand the explosion of a small star. The thought that any primitive species could challenge such might seemed absurd. "Let me begin with our first encounter," Kexthara continued, his voice growing distant as he recalled events that had occurred only 3 rotations ago but felt like a lifetime. The humans had established colonies on 17 worlds by the time we arrived at their home system. Standard procedure dictated we demonstrate our superiority by destroying one of their outer settlements first. He paused, accessing the holographic display that materialized in the center of the chamber. The image showed a blue-green world orbiting a yellow star, with several artificial structures visible on its surface and in orbit. This was Kepler 442b, which they called New Eden. Population, approximately 2 million humans. Defense grid, laughable by our standards. A few orbital platforms with kinetic weapons and what appeared to be primitive missile systems. We expected to complete the demonstration in less than 1 standard time unit. The display zoomed in to show the Zephyrian fleet approaching the human colony. 50 vessels, each 1 kilometer in length. Their dark hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Commander Thexvol led the assault with 3 destroyers and a cruiser. The humans' orbital defenses activated as expected, launching their primitive missiles and firing their kinetic rounds. Our shields absorbed everything without strain. Thexvol began the bombardment sequence. The holographic display showed brilliant streams of plasma fire descending toward the planet's surface, each beam carrying enough energy to vaporize a city block. But as the assembled commanders watched, something unexpected happened. The humans did not surrender. Kexthara said simply. They did not flee. They did not broadcast pleas for mercy. Instead, they did something we had never encountered in 1,000 years of conquest. The display showed the colony's surface erupting in thousands of small explosions as the human settlements seemed to destroy themselves. They activated what they called a scorched earth protocol. In the time it took our plasma beams to reach the surface, they had systematically destroyed every structure, every resource, every piece of technology that might be useful to an occupying force. But that was only the beginning. Admiral Quendara's crest pulsed deep blue with confusion. Surely this was simple spite, General. Many species destroy their own resources rather than see them captured. This is not unprecedented. You are correct, Admiral, Kexthara replied. What was unprecedented was what came next. As our ships moved into low orbit to begin salvage operations, the humans revealed their true nature. The holographic display shifted to show the apparently dead colony world from space. Suddenly, the image erupted with new activity as thousands of objects launched from hidden positions on the planet's surface. They had hollowed out the planet's crust with tunnels and bunkers that our deep scan sensors had somehow missed. Every human on that world had become part of their military response. Men, women, even their young were organized into what they called resistance cells. They launched everything they had. The display showed a swarm of human ships rising from the planet's surface. Unlike the sleek, purpose-built vessels of the Zephyrian fleet, these craft were clearly improvised. Civilian transports had been converted into attack ships, mining vessels carried improvised weapons, and everywhere were the small, agile fighters that humans seemed to prefer. Thexvol was not concerned, Kexthara continued. His 4 ships outmassed the entire human response by a factor of 20. Their weapons were primitive, their shields barely functional. He ordered his destroyers to begin elimination of the escapees. The holographic battle began to play out before the assembled commanders. The massive Zephyrian destroyers opened fire with their plasma arrays, each shot capable of vaporizing the largest human vessel. Many shots found their targets, and human ships died in brilliant flashes of light. But for every human ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The humans did not engage in the orderly battle formations that dominated galactic warfare. Instead, they swarmed like insects, coming from all directions at once. The humans had studied our tactics, Kekstara explained, as the display showed human fighters weaving between plasma blasts that should have been impossible to avoid. They knew our weapons were designed for engagement at long range against similarly massive targets. They sacrificed their larger vessels to get their smaller craft close enough for attack runs. The assembled commanders watched in growing unease as the human fighters reached the Zephyrian destroyers. The alien vessels' point defense systems activated, filling space with a web of energy that should have vaporized any approaching threat. This is where we learned our first lesson about human warfare, Kekstara said grimly. They do not consider any action too costly if it achieves their objective. They do not calculate acceptable losses in the way we do. The display showed human fighters flying directly into the point defense fire, their ships exploding one after another. But for every fighter destroyed, others made it through the defensive screen. When they reached the destroyer's hull, the humans revealed another surprise. They had loaded their fighters with nuclear devices, Kekthara said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not nuclear weapons, nuclear devices. Crude bombs that they detonated manually, sacrificing their own lives to damage our vessels. The display showed human fighter after fighter slamming into the destroyer's hull, each impact followed by a brilliant nuclear flash. The Zephyrian ship's shields flared and began to fail under the concentrated assault. But even that was not the worst part, Kekstara continued. As Thexvol's flagship began to take serious damage, the humans revealed their true strategic thinking. The display pulled back to show the entire battle zone. While the human fighters were sacrificing themselves against the destroyers, other human vessels were moving with purpose towards specific locations in space. They had identified our ship's weak points through analysis of our shield harmonics, Kekstara explained. While we were focused on their apparent suicide attacks, their true objective was to position explosive devices at precise locations that would create resonance cascades in our defensive grids. The assembled commanders watched in stunned silence as the human plan unfolded. At predetermined moments, the human devices detonated, not to cause direct damage, but to create specific frequencies that interfered with the Zephyrian shield generators. Thexvol realized what was happening and ordered immediate retreat, Kekstara said, but the humans had anticipated this as well. They had used the first part of the battle to map our vessel's movement patterns and had prepared for our withdrawal. The display showed the Zephyrian ships beginning their tactical withdrawal, but as they moved, previously hidden human vessels emerged from behind asteroids and debris fields, cutting off their escape routes. The humans had been planning this engagement from the moment our ships entered their system, Kekstara continued. Everything we had seen, the colony, the defenses, even the desperate last stand, had been theater designed to lure us into a predetermined killing ground. The battle's conclusion played out with mechanical precision. The human forces, no longer appearing as desperate survivors but as a coordinated military machine, systematically disabled the Zephyrian vessels. The humans did not seek to destroy the enemy ships but to capture them intact. Of Thexvol's 4 vessels, 2 were completely captured and 2 were disabled but recoverable, Kekstara reported. The humans took 1,500 prisoners, including Thexvol himself. But more importantly, they gained access to our technology, our tactical databases, and our strategic communications codes. High Commander Veltran's crest had faded to a dull gray as the implications became clear. General, surely this was an isolated incident. One clever trap does not make these humans a significant threat to the Empire. Kekstara's 3 eyes fixed on the High Commander with something approaching pity. Honored sir, that was just the first day of what would become a 6-month campaign that would change everything I believed about warfare, about military strategy, and about the nature of conflict itself. The general gestured to the holographic display, which now showed a star map of the local sector. Red indicators marked Zephyrian positions while blue showed human territories. What you must understand, honored commanders, is that the battle for New Eden was not an isolated engagement. It was the opening move of a larger strategy that the humans had been developing for decades. They had been studying us through intercepted communications in observation of our previous conquests. They knew we were coming long before we arrived. Admiral Quendara's bioluminescence flickered with confusion. But our intelligence network showed no indication of such preparation. How could a primitive species have evaded our surveillance? Because, Kextara replied, they think differently about intelligence gathering than we do. Where we rely on technological superiority and direct observation, humans use deception, misdirection, and psychological manipulation as primary weapons. The display showed a series of human settlements and colonies, each one appearing to be developing along predictable lines of technological advancement and population growth. Every human colony we had observed was designed to present a specific impression to our scouts, Kextara explained. They wanted us to see primitive defenses, limited industrial capacity, and a decentralized command structure that would be easy to defeat piecemeal. But behind this facade, they were building the most sophisticated military network we have ever encountered. The display shifted to show the hidden reality beneath the human colony's apparent simplicity. Underground facilities connected by quantum communication networks, weapons manufacturing complexes disguised as civilian industrial sites, and training facilities that had been producing soldiers for decades. The humans call this asymmetric warfare, Kextara continued. They do not attempt to match our technological advantages directly. Instead, they identify our weaknesses and exploit them with tactics we have never encountered. Commander Zixpara leaned forward, her crest pulsing with curiosity. What weaknesses, General? The Zephyrian military doctrine has been refined over a millennium of successful campaigns. Kextara's mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter amusement. That, Commander, was precisely our weakness. Our doctrine assumes that all species will fight according to recognizable patterns. We prepare for enemies who value their lives, who seek to minimize casualties, who fight for territory and resources and political objectives. He paused, allowing the implications to settle in the minds of his audience. Humans fight for concepts that have no material value. They die for ideals that cannot be quantified. They sacrifice everything for abstract principles that we cannot even properly translate into our language. And this makes them completely unpredictable by our strategic models. The holographic display now showed intercepted human communications from the battle. The translation matrices struggled with concepts that had no equivalent in Zephyrian understanding. Listen to these transmissions, Kextara said. Human commander to his pilots as they began their suicide attacks. Remember why we fight. Remember freedom. Remember Earth. Not strategic objectives, not resources, not even survival. Abstract concepts that they were willing to die for. The assembled commanders listened to the translated voices of human pilots as they flew their fighters into certain death. There was no desperation in their voices, no fear, no regret. Instead, there was something that chilled the Zephyrian commanders to their core. Joy. They were happy to die, Kextara said quietly. Happy to sacrifice themselves for their cause. And this happiness, this eagerness for martyrdom, made them more dangerous than any weapon we had ever faced. The general paused, surveying the increasingly uncomfortable expressions of his fellow officers. Their bioluminescent crests had dimmed to barely visible glows as they processed the implications of what they were hearing. But even their willingness to die was not the most disturbing aspect of human warfare, Kextara continued. What truly unsettled me was their capacity for learning and adaptation. Within hours of the first engagement, they had modified their tactics to counter our responses. The display showed the aftermath of the New Eden battle, with human salvage crews working to recover technology from both destroyed human vessels and captured Zephyria equipment. They learned from every engagement, incorporated captured technology with frightening speed, and shared information across their entire species through networks we still do not fully understand. Kextara explained. By the time we engaged their second colony world, they had developed countermeasures for every tactic we had used at New Eden. Admiral Quendara's crest flickered with disbelief. Surely you exaggerate, General. No species can adapt that quickly. Kextara activated another section of the holographic display, showing the second engagement in the human campaign. This was the battle for Kepler 186F, which the humans called New Harmony. Based on our experience at New Eden, I modified our approach. Instead of allowing them to lure us into close combat, I ordered bombardment from maximum range, using our heaviest plasma artillery. The display showed the Zephyrian fleet maintaining distance from the human colony while raining down destruction from space. But as the assembled commanders watched, they saw that the human response was completely different from their previous tactics. They had prepared for our adaptation to their strategy, Kextara said grimly. Instead of hiding underground or attempting to engage our fleet directly, they had evacuated their entire population to mobile habitats in the outer system. The display showed thousands of human vessels scattered throughout the asteroid belt and outer planets of the system, each one too small and too distant to target effectively with the Zephyrian fleet's weapons. But more importantly, they had prepared a surprise that demonstrated their true understanding of warfare. Kexthara continued. As we bombarded their empty colony world, they launched a coordinated strike against our supply lines. The display zoomed out to show the larger strategic picture. While the Zephyrian fleet was focused on destroying the human colony, human forces had simultaneously attacked the Empire's logistics bases in 3 adjacent systems.
They understood that destroying our fleet was less important than cutting off our ability to sustain operations, Kexthara explained.
While we were focused on tactical victories, they were thinking strategically about the entire campaign. The assembled commanders watched in growing horror as the display showed human forces systematically destroying fuel depots, supply convoys, and communications relays throughout the sector. In one coordinated operation, they crippled our ability to maintain extended operations in their territory, Kexthara said. They had studied our logistics requirements and identified every vulnerable point in our supply chain.
High Commander Veltron's voice was barely audible above the chamber's environmental systems.
How did they coordinate such a complex operation without our intelligence networks detecting it? 'Cause they had infiltrated our intelligence networks, Kexthara replied simply. While we were observing them, they were observing us. They had learned our communication protocols, our operational procedures, even our command structure. The display showed a complex web of information flow, with human agents positioned at key points throughout the Zephyrian command hierarchy. They call it intelligence warfare, Kexthara continued. The systematic gathering and manipulation of information to achieve strategic advantage. They had been feeding us false intelligence about their capabilities while learning everything about ours. The general's 3 eyes dimmed as he recalled the growing realization that had dawned on him during those first encounters with humanity. I began to understand that we were not fighting a primitive species defending their territory, he said. We were fighting a species that had been preparing for galactic warfare since they first looked up at the stars. Every aspect of their society, their technology, their culture had been shaped by the expectation of eventual conflict with superior forces. The display now showed human historical records that had been captured during the campaign. Images of human conflicts throughout their development, from primitive tribal warfare to global conflicts involving millions of soldiers. They had been fighting each other for thousands of years, Kexthara explained. Every human military innovation had been tested in actual combat against opponents who were equally intelligent, equally motivated, and equally ruthless. Their entire species had been forged in the crucible of constant warfare. The assembled commanders stared at the images with growing unease. Humans fighting with primitive weapons, with industrial-age technology, with nuclear weapons, and finally with the early space-age equipment they used against the Zephyrian Empire. But it was not just their military experience that made them dangerous, Kexthara continued. It was their fundamental understanding of what warfare really means. He gestured to the display, which now showed a human city during what their records called World War II. The image showed humans continuing to live, work, and raise families, even as enemy bombs fell around them. They understand that war is not just a conflict between military forces, Kexthara said. It is a contest of will between entire populations. And the human will to resist is unlike anything we have encountered in 1,000 years of conquest. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of the environmental systems. The assembled commanders were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. This concludes my report on the initial engagements with the human species, Kexthara said. What I have shared represents only the first few days of a campaign that would ultimately force me to reconsider everything I believed about military strategy, about the nature of conflict, and about our empire's place in the galaxy. He paused, surveying the uncomfortable expressions of his fellow officers. In the next portion of my report, I will detail how the humans escalated beyond conventional warfare into tactics that violated every principle of civilized conflict, and how their escalation forced us to confront the possibility that we might not just lose this war, but lose it so decisively that the Empire itself might not survive. The general's words hung in the air like a physical presence, filling the chamber with dread and anticipation. The assembled commanders knew that what they had heard so far was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they believed about their civilization's superiority. As Kexthara prepared to continue his account, the weight of what was to come settled over the War Council like a shroud. They were about to learn how the mightiest empire in the galaxy had been brought to the brink of destruction by a species that had barely reached the stars. General Kexthara observed the War Council chamber with weary resignation. The assembled commanders sat in stunned silence, their bioluminescent crests dim with confusion and growing fear. What he had shared about humanity's initial tactical capabilities had shaken their confidence, but they could not yet comprehend the true depth of the threat they faced. "Honored commanders," Kextara continued, his crystalline voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "What I described in our previous session was merely humanity's conventional military response. What followed would force us to confront an enemy that operates by principles completely alien to our understanding of civilized warfare." High Commander Veltran's crest flickered weakly. "General, surely no species could pose a genuine threat to the Empire's might once we committed our full military resources. The incidents you described, while troubling, involved only a small portion of our forces." Kextara's three eyes focused on Veltran with something approaching pity. "Honored sir, that is precisely the thinking that led to our next miscalculation. After the setbacks at New Eden and New Harmony, High Command authorized me to deploy the entire Fifth Fleet 250 vessels, including our newest dreadnoughts and carrier groups. The holographic display materialized once again, showing the massive Zephyrian fleet assembled at the edge of human space. The sight was genuinely impressive. Enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems, protected by shields that could withstand stellar plasma. The target was Earth itself, Kextara said quietly. High Command reasoned that by striking at their homeworld, we would force the humans into a direct engagement where our superior technology and numbers would ensure victory. We expected desperate resistance, but ultimately a swift conclusion to the campaign. Admiral Quendara leaned forward, her crest pulsing with curiosity. Surely the humans could not hope to defend their homeworld against such overwhelming force. That assumption, Kextara replied, demonstrated our fundamental misunderstanding of how humans think about warfare. We approached Earth expecting a siege, a desperate last stand by defenders protecting their most precious world. The display showed the Fifth Fleet's approach to the Sol system, with Earth visible as a blue marble surrounded by orbital installations and defensive platforms. The human defenses appeared substantial, but hopelessly outmatched by the approaching Zephyrian armada. What we found instead was a trap more sophisticated than anything we had encountered in our 1,000-year military history, Kextara continued. The humans had not concentrated their forces to defend Earth. Instead, they had turned their entire home system into a weapon. The display zoomed in to show the inner solar system in greater detail. What had initially appeared to be civilian infrastructure mining stations, orbital habitats, research facilities, began revealing hidden military capabilities. Every asteroid mining operation in the belt had been converted into a weapons platform, Kextara explained. Every orbital habitat housed missile batteries. Every civilian transport carried concealed military hardware. The humans had militarized their entire civilization without our intelligence networks detecting it. Commander Zixpera's bioluminescence flickered with disbelief. But such a transformation would require massive resources, perfect coordination, and decades of preparation. How could a species achieve this without detection? Because they had been preparing for this moment since their first contact with galactic civilization, Kextara answered. Every human treaty negotiation, every trade agreement, every diplomatic interaction had been designed to gather intelligence about potential threats. They knew the Empire would eventually come for them, and they had spent a century preparing. The display showed the true scope of human preparation. Hidden manufacturing facilities throughout the system had been producing weapons and defensive systems using technologies reverse-engineered from captured alien equipment. Communication networks using quantum entanglement allowed instantaneous coordination across interplanetary distances. But the most shocking discovery was their approach to casualties. Kextara said, his voice growing darker. When we began our attack, we expected the humans to attempt to minimize civilian losses, to evacuate non-combatants, to follow the basic principles of warfare that govern all civilized species. The holographic battle began, showing the massive Zephyrian fleet opening fire on human defensive positions. Plasma beams and graviton torpedoes lanced out toward the human installations, each weapon carrying enough energy to devastate a city. The humans made no attempt to protect their civilian population, Kextara continued. Instead, they incorporated their non-combatants into their military strategy. Every human in the system became part of their defensive network. The assembled commanders watched in growing horror as the display showed human civilian vessels flying directly into the Zephyrian weapons fire, not to escape but to provide targeting data and tactical intelligence for the hidden military assets. They used their own people as reconnaissance drones. Kextara said quietly, Families with children flew their personal craft into our firing lines to map our weapon patterns and energy signatures. They transmitted everything they observed before they died. Admiral Quendara's crest had faded to almost invisible luminescence. Such behavior is incomprehensible. No rational species would sacrifice non-combatants for mere tactical advantage. That is where we made our crucial error, Kexthara replied. We assumed that humans operate according to rational cost-benefit analysis. We believed that sufficient losses would force them to surrender. We could not comprehend a species that considers death preferable to defeat. The display showed the battle escalating as more human assets revealed themselves. What had appeared to be a one-sided engagement began shifting as human weapon systems emerged from camouflaged positions throughout the solar system. The humans had spent decades studying our technology, Kexthara explained. Not just to understand it, but to develop specific countermeasures. Every weapon system in our arsenal had been analyzed and defeated. The commanders watched as human weapons began finding their targets despite the Zephyrian fleet's superior shielding and armor. Instead of trying to match the Empire's technology directly, the humans had developed exotic weapons that exploited previously unknown vulnerabilities. They used gravitational field manipulators to create resonance cascades in our hull metals, Kexthara said as the display showed Zephyrian vessels beginning to suffer structural failures. They deployed quantum viruses that corrupted our targeting computers. They even weaponized black hole microjets to penetrate our energy shields. High Commander Veltran stared at the display with undisguised shock. Such technology should be beyond their capabilities. How could a species develop such sophisticated weapons without access to our research databases? Because they think about technology differently than we do, Kexthara answered. Where we refine existing systems to achieve incremental improvements, humans approach each problem from completely new angles. They are willing to pursue research that other species would consider too dangerous or impractical. The display showed human research facilities throughout their system, many of them conducting experiments that would be considered recklessly hazardous by galactic standards. Artificial black holes, controlled antimatter reactions, even attempts to manipulate space-time itself. They had turned their entire civilization into a research laboratory, dedicated to developing weapons capable of defeating superior technology. Kexthara continued, and they had done this knowing that many of their experiments would result in catastrophic failures that would kill thousands of their own people. The assembled commanders watched footage of human facilities suffering containment breaches, antimatter explosions, and gravitational anomalies that devastated entire installations. But in each case, the surviving humans simply rebuilt and continued their research. They accepted massive casualties as an acceptable cost of weapons development, Kexthara said. Concepts that we would never consider due to safety concerns, they pursued with deadly determination. And this willingness to sacrifice everything for military advancement gave them capabilities that should have been impossible. The battle display continued, showing the Zephyrian fleet suffering increasingly severe losses as human weapon systems revealed their true effectiveness. But what disturbed Kexthara most was not the humans' technological achievements, but their tactical doctrine. As our casualties mounted, I expected the humans to offer terms for surrender, he said. Standard military doctrine suggests that once an enemy has demonstrated their capacity for resistance, negotiation becomes preferable to continued bloodshed. The display showed Zephyrian commanders attempting to open communication channels with human leadership, broadcasting standard surrender terms and ceasefire agreements. The humans responded to our diplomatic overtures with an escalation that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Kexthara continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They began targeting our medical facilities and supply ships. They attacked vessels attempting to recover survivors from damaged craft. They showed no mercy to disabled enemies. Admiral Quendara's shock was visible in the complete absence of bioluminescence from her crest. Such actions violate the most basic conventions of galactic warfare. Even the most aggressive species observe protocols regarding medical personnel and rescue operations. The humans, Kexthara replied, do not recognize such conventions when fighting for their survival. They view anything that supports the enemy war effort as a legitimate target. This includes medical ships, supply vessels, even rescue craft attempting to save survivors. The display showed human forces systematically hunting down damaged Zephyrian vessels, destroying ships that were attempting to disengage from combat, and targeting support craft that posed no direct military threat. But their most disturbing tactic was their treatment of prisoners, Kexthara continued. When they captured our personnel, they did not hold them in military detention facilities or attempt to exchange them for their own captured soldiers. The general paused, his mandibles clicking nervously as he recalled events that still haunted his sleep cycles. They used our captured personnel as test subjects for biological weapons research, he said quietly. They studied our physiology, our psychology, our technological interfaces. They learned everything they could about how to kill us more efficiently. The assembled commanders sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. The humans had not just violated the conventions of warfare, they had abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior entirely. The captured Zephyrians were kept conscious during the experiments, Kexthara continued. The humans wanted them to suffer, to understand that resistance to humanity would result not just in death, but in agony that would serve their military research. Commander Zixpura's voice was barely audible. Surely such barbarity cannot be representative of their entire species.
That was what I hoped, Kextara replied.
Until I received the intercepted communications from Earth's civilian government approving and funding the experimental programs. The torture of prisoners was not the action of rogue military units. It was official policy supported by their entire population. The display showed human civilian leaders discussing the prisoner research programs with the same detached professionalism that other species might use to discuss crop yields or trade negotiations.
They spoke of our people as if they were laboratory animals, Kexthara said.
Resources to be consumed in the pursuit of military advantage. They felt no moral conflict about causing suffering, no hesitation about violating every principle that civilized species hold sacred. The battle display continued to show the degrading situation in the Sol system. The Zephyrian fleet, despite its overwhelming initial advantage, was being systematically destroyed by human weapons that seemed to violate the known laws of physics. By the third day of the engagement, I had lost 40% of my fleet, Kexthara reported. Our technological advantages were meaningless against enemies who were willing to sacrifice everything and ignore all moral constraints. I made the decision to withdraw to reassess our strategy. The display showed the remnants of the Fifth Fleet attempting to disengage from the human forces and withdraw to safe distance. But as the commanders watched, they saw that the humans had no intention of allowing their enemies to escape. The humans pursued our retreating forces with a ferocity that defied military logic, Kexthara continued. Instead of consolidating their defensive victory, they launched immediate counterattacks against our withdrawal routes. Human vessels, many of them damaged and barely operational, followed the Zephyrian fleet as it attempted to reach the edge of the system. The humans showed no concern for their own casualties, throwing ship after ship into attacks that had little chance of success, but gradually wore down the retreating enemy. They were not satisfied with defending their homeworld, Kexthara explained. They wanted to destroy every Zephyrian vessel in their system, to ensure that none of us survived to report their capabilities or plan future attacks. The display showed the running battle as it continued for days, with human forces harrying the Zephyrian retreat and inflicting casualties on ships that posed no threat to Earth's defenses. But their most chilling action came as we finally reached the system's edge, Kexthara said. The humans had prepared one final demonstration of their commitment to total warfare. The display showed a massive human vessel, clearly a converted civilian transport, accelerating toward the retreating Zephyrian fleet. As it approached, sensors revealed that the ship's cargo holds had been filled with antimatter, enough to create an explosion equivalent to a small stellar detonation. The ship contained 10,000 human civilians, Kexthara said quietly. Families, children, elderly people who had volunteered to die in order to destroy a few more enemy vessels. They transmitted their final message as they approached our position. The assembled commanders listened to the translated human voices, speaking calmly and cheerfully as they flew towards certain death. Parents explaining to their children why they needed to die, elderly humans expressing pride in their final contribution to the war effort, young people singing songs about their homeworld. They detonated the antimatter device at the precise moment of maximum damage to our fleet, Kexthara continued. 17 more ships were destroyed, and the explosion was visible from Earth as a new star in their night sky. The general paused, allowing the full horror of human warfare doctrine to settle in the minds of his audience. That night, as we limped away from their system with less than half our original force, I received a communication from the human leadership, he said. Not a demand for surrender, not a negotiation for peace, but a simple message that still haunts my sleep cycles. The display showed the text of the human message, translated into Zephyrian script. This was only the beginning. We know where you come from. We are coming for you. The War Council chamber fell into absolute silence. The assembled commanders stared at the display with the growing realization that they faced an enemy unlike anything in their military experience. The humans had not just defeated our attack, Kexthara said. They had learned everything they needed to know about our technology, our tactics, and our psychology, and they had decided that the best defense was to carry the war to our territory. High Commander Veltran's voice was barely a whisper. General, surely you are suggesting that these humans would actually attempt to attack the Empire itself? Kexthara's three eyes fixed on the High Commander with an expression of absolute certainty. Honored sir, the humans were not just planning to attack the Empire. They were already doing it. The display shifted to show a galactic map with the locations of Zephyrian military installations throughout the sector. Red warning indicators began appearing at facilities throughout the Empire's territory. While we were engaged at Earth, human infiltrators had already begun operations against our infrastructure. Kextara explained. They had spent decades placing agents throughout our civilization, learning our weaknesses, and preparing for a campaign of systematic destruction. The assembled commanders stared in growing horror as the scope of human preparation became clear. The species they had dismissed as primitive had been planning galactic warfare for generations. What I have described represents only the first phase of human military doctrine, Kextara said. Their defensive operations designed to buy time while their true strategic weapons were prepared for deployment. He surveyed the shocked faces of his fellow officers, seeing his own fears reflected in their expressions. In the next portion of my report, I will detail the human counteroffensive and the weapons they deployed that forced me to recommend the unthinkable: immediate peace negotiations and complete withdrawal from human territory. The general's words carried a finality that filled the chamber with dread. The assembled commanders realized that what they had heard so far was merely the beginning of humanity's demonstration of their capacity for warfare. As Kexthara prepared to continue his account, the weight of impending revelations settled over the War Council. They were about to learn how a species that had barely reached the stars had brought the mightiest empire in the galaxy to its knees. The bioluminescent crests of the assembled War Council had dimmed to barely visible glows as General Kexthara prepared to continue his account. The magnitude of what they had already learned about human warfare capabilities hung heavy in the chamber's recycled atmosphere, but the veteran commander knew that the worst was yet to come. Honored commanders, Kexthara began, his crystalline voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. What I have described thus far represents humanity's defensive capabilities. What followed would demonstrate that their true military philosophy extends far beyond protecting their own territory. The holographic display materialized, showing the galactic sector containing both human space and the outer regions of the Zephyrian Empire. Red warning indicators pulsed at dozens of locations throughout Zephyrian territory, each one representing a strategic installation that had gone silent in the wake of the Sol System engagement. While we were retreating from Earth with the remnants of the Fifth Fleet, human agents who had been positioned throughout our territory for decades began their coordinated offensive. Kexthara explained. They struck simultaneously at targets across a region spanning nearly 200 light years. High Commander Veltran leaned forward, his crest flickering weakly. Surely, General, you are not suggesting that humans had infiltrated our most secure military installations? Kexthara's three eyes focused on the High Commander with grim certainty. Honored sir, the humans had not merely infiltrated our installations, they had systematically compromised our entire command structure, our communications networks, and our logistical systems. The display zoomed in to show the Kepler military nexus, one of the Empire's most heavily defended strategic centers. The facility's massive orbital platforms and energy shields should have made it impregnable to any conceivable attack. The Kepler nexus fell within the first hour of the human offensive, Kexthara said quietly. Not to an external assault, but to coordinated sabotage from within. Human agents who had spent years establishing themselves as trusted personnel activated pre-positioned explosives throughout the facility's critical systems. Admiral Quindara's voice barely registered above the chamber's environmental systems. How could our security protocols have failed so completely? Because the humans understand something about infiltration that we had never encountered, Kexthara replied. They do not simply place spies in our organizations. They create entire false identities, complete synthetic life histories that can withstand the most thorough investigation. The display showed personnel records for dozens of Zephyrian military and civilian officials who had served with distinction for years before revealing themselves as human agents. Each record was flawless, supported by documentation that traced back decades. They had surgically altered their appearances to mimic our physical characteristics, Kexthara continued. They used bioengineered implants to replicate our bioluminescent communications. They even modified their neural patterns to fool our psychological evaluation systems. The assembled commanders stared at the images with growing horror. The human agents looked exactly like Zephyrians, spoke like Zephyrians, even thought like Zephyrians according to every test their civilization had devised. But more disturbing than their physical deception was their psychological preparation, Kexthara said. These agents had lived as Zephyrians for so long that they had formed genuine relationships with their colleagues. They had friends, romantic partners, even offspring with native Zephyrians. Commander Zixpara's bioluminescence had faded to almost nothing. You are describing individuals who had integrated completely into our society. How could they maintain loyalty to humanity under such circumstances? That question haunted me throughout the campaign, Kexthara admitted, until I captured one of their agents and learned the true depth of human psychological conditioning. The display showed interrogation footage of a creature that appeared to be a perfectly normal Zephyrian officer, indistinguishable from any other member of their species except for the cold intelligence in its eyes. The agent identified herself as Commander Melvora of the 4th Strategic Intelligence Division, Kexthara continued. She had served in that position for 8 years, had received commendations for exceptional service, had even saved Zephyrian lives during a reactor emergency on Proxima Station. The display showed Commander Melvora's service record, filled with exemplary performance evaluations and grateful testimonials from fellow officers who considered her a trusted friend and colleague. When I asked her how she could betray people who had trusted her, who had considered her family, her response revealed the fundamental difference between human and civilized psychology. Kexthara said, his voice growing darker. The interrogation footage showed the human agent's calm, matter-of-fact response to the general's questions about her betrayal of friends and colleagues. She told me that she felt genuine affection for the Zephyrians she had worked with, Kexthara continued. She considered many of them friends. She even expressed regret that her actions would result in their deaths. But she explained that personal feelings were irrelevant when measured against her species' survival. The assembled commanders listened to the translated conversation with growing unease. The human agent's voice contained no hatred, no anger, no fanaticism. She spoke about the necessity of destroying Zephyrian civilization with the same calm professionalism that a technician might use to discuss routine maintenance procedures. She had been psychologically conditioned from birth to prioritize human survival above all other considerations, Kexthara explained. Her ability to form genuine emotional attachments had been preserved, but those attachments could not override her fundamental programming to serve humanity's interests. The display showed brain scans of the captured agent, revealing neural modifications that had been made during her early development. The alterations were so subtle that they appeared to be natural variations in brain structure rather than artificial conditioning. The humans had created a generation of perfect infiltrators, Kexthara said. Individuals who could live convincing lives as members of other species while maintaining absolute loyalty to humanity. They felt real emotions, formed real relationships, but when the time came, they executed their missions without hesitation. Admiral Quendara's crest flickered with a question she seemed afraid to ask. General, how many of these agents had the humans placed throughout our territory? Kexthara's response sent a chill through the entire War Council. Based on the coordinated nature of their attacks, I estimate that there were at least 10,000 human agents operating within the Empire's borders, possibly more. The magnitude of the infiltration became clear as the display showed the scope of human operations. Military bases throughout the sector had been sabotaged simultaneously, communication networks had been corrupted, and supply lines had been severed in a coordinated campaign that demonstrated decades of preparation. But the infiltration was only the first phase of their counteroffensive, Kexthara continued. While their agents were crippling our infrastructure from within, human military forces were launching direct attacks against our most important strategic assets. The display shifted to show human fleet formations moving through hyperspace towards Zephyrian territory. Unlike the desperate improvisation that had characterized their defense of Earth, these forces moved with the precision and coordination of a military machine that had been planning this campaign for generations. The human ships were unlike anything we had encountered in our previous engagements, Kexthara said. They had clearly spent the years since first contact developing vessels specifically designed for offensive operations against Zephyrian technology. The assembled commanders watched as the human fleet formations came into view. The ships were sleek, predatory, and equipped with weapon systems that seemed to bend the known laws of physics. They had developed stealth technology that rendered their vessels completely invisible to our sensors, Kexthara explained. Not just difficult to detect, but literally undetectable by any means at our disposal. They could position entire fleets within striking distance of our installations without our knowledge. The display showed Zephyrian defense platforms scanning empty space, while human vessels moved freely through their detection grids. The implications were terrifying. Humanity could strike anywhere at any time without warning. But their stealth capabilities were only the beginning, Kekstara continued. They had also developed weapons that specifically targeted our technological advantages. The display showed human vessels opening fire on Zephyrian installations with weapons that seemed to ignore conventional defensive systems entirely. Energy shields that had withstood stellar plasma simply collapsed when exposed to human weapons fire. They used quantum disruptors that collapsed our shield matrices at the molecular level, Kekstara explained. Gravitational manipulators that crushed our hull armor regardless of its thickness. Even stranger weapons that seemed to alter the fundamental constants of physics within localized areas. High Commander Veltran stared at the display with undisguised shock. Such weapons should be theoretically impossible. How could any species develop technology that violates the basic laws of the universe? Because humans approach scientific research differently than civilized species. Kekstara replied, where we seek to work within natural laws, they seek to exploit loopholes and exceptions. They are willing to pursue research that other species would consider too dangerous or impossible. The display showed human research facilities conducting experiments that defied conventional understanding. Controlled violations of causality, manipulation of quantum probability, even attempts to access parallel dimensions for military advantage. They had weaponized concepts that our scientists considered purely theoretical, Kekstara continued, and they had done so with a reckless disregard for the potential consequences that would horrify any rational civilization. The assembled commanders watched footage of human experiments that resulted in massive casualties and environmental devastation, but in each case the humans simply accepted the losses and continued their research with grim determination. Their first major target was the Vega Defense Complex, Kekstara said, refocusing on the military campaign. The installation protected 3-star systems and served as our primary staging area for operations in the sector. The display showed the massive Vega complex with its orbital fortresses and defensive platforms capable of holding off any conceivable attack. The installation had never been successfully assaulted in 500 years of operation. The human attack began with their infiltrators sabotaging the complex's early warning systems. Kekstara continued. By the time we realized we were under assault, human forces were already inside our defensive perimeter. The battle footage showed human vessels materializing from apparent nothingness, their stealth fields dropping as they opened fire at point-blank range. The Zephyrian defenders, caught completely off guard, struggled to respond to an attack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But what made the assault truly devastating was the humans' use of psychological warfare, Kekstara said, his voice growing darker. They broadcasted live footage of the torture and execution of captured Zephyrian personnel throughout the engagement. The assembled commanders watched in horror as human forces systematically murdered prisoners in front of their colleagues, using the emotional trauma to disrupt Zephyrian command decisions and morale. They understood that Zephyrians formed strong emotional bonds with their comrades, Kekstara explained. They exploited our compassion as a weapon, knowing that witnessing the suffering of our friends would impair our tactical judgment. The display showed Zephyrian commanders making increasingly desperate decisions as they watched their personnel being tortured to death by human forces. Officers abandoned strategic positions to attempt rescue missions, defensive formations broke apart as units tried to protect their comrades, and the entire defensive structure collapsed under the weight of emotional trauma. The Vega complex fell within 6 hours, Kekstara reported. Not because our weapons were inadequate or our defenses insufficient, but because the humans had systematically destroyed our ability to function as a coordinated military force. Admiral Quendara's voice was barely a whisper. Surely such tactics violate every convention of civilized warfare. The humans, Kekstara replied, do not recognize such conventions when fighting for their survival. They view any tactic that achieves victory as legitimate, regardless of moral considerations that would constrain civilized species. The display showed the aftermath of the Vega assault, with human forces systematically destroying every piece of Zephyrian technology they could not capture. But more disturbing was their treatment of the installation's personnel. The humans took approximately 15,000 prisoners at Vega, Kekstara continued. They used them for biological experiments, psychological research, and as test subjects for new weapons systems. But they also did something more subtle and more disturbing. The general paused, his mandibles clicking nervously as he recalled events that still haunted his sleep cycles. They released selected prisoners back to our territory, he said. Individuals who had been subjected to psychological conditioning designed to spread terror throughout our ranks. The display showed Zephyrian personnel who had been returned from human captivity. their behavior clearly altered by their experiences. They spoke obsessively about human capabilities, expressed despair about the Empire's ability to resist, and gradually infected their colleagues with their psychological trauma. The returned prisoners became vectors for a form of psychological warfare we had never encountered, Kextara explained. They spread accounts of human capabilities that were designed to demoralize our forces and undermine confidence in our military leadership. Commander Zixpara leaned forward, her crest flickering with confusion. But surely these accounts could be dismissed as enemy propaganda? That was the diabolical genius of human psychological warfare, Kextara replied. The accounts were completely accurate. The returned prisoners told the truth about human capabilities, about the horrors they had witnessed, about the futility of conventional resistance. The assembled commanders realized the implications with growing dread. The humans had used the truth itself as a weapon, knowing that accurate reports of their capabilities would be more demoralizing than any fiction. As word of the Vega assault spread throughout our territory, it became increasingly difficult to maintain unit cohesion and morale, Kextara continued. Our personnel began to understand that they faced an enemy that operated by completely different rules than any they had encountered. The display showed reports from Zephyrian commanders throughout the sector, describing increasing incidents of desertion, psychological breakdown, and refusal to engage human forces. The Empire's military discipline was collapsing under the weight of fear. But the humans were not content with psychological warfare alone, Kextara said. They had prepared weapons that would force us to confront the possibility of our complete extinction as a species. The general's words sent a chill through the War Council chamber. The assembled commanders realized that what they had heard so far was merely the preliminary phase of humanity's campaign. The humans had developed biological weapons specifically designed to target Zephyrian physiology, Kextara continued. Viruses that could survive in our atmospheric conditions and spread through our population centers with terrifying efficiency. The display showed microscopic images of the human bioweapons, elegant in their simplicity and horrifying in their effectiveness. The pathogens had been designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Zephyrian immune systems. They tested these weapons on our captured personnel, Kextara said quietly, documenting the progression of the diseases, refining their effectiveness, preparing for deployment against our civilian population. The assembled commanders sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. The humans were prepared to commit genocide on a galactic scale to achieve their military objectives. But perhaps most disturbing was their development of what they called planet-killer weapons. Kextara continued. Devices capable of sterilizing entire worlds or rendering them uninhabitable for centuries. The display showed massive human vessels equipped with weapon systems that defied conventional understanding. Gravity manipulators capable of destabilizing planetary cores, atmospheric processes that could alter the chemical composition of entire biospheres, even stranger devices that seemed to alter the fundamental properties of matter itself. They had prepared to destroy every world in our territory if we continued to resist their demands, Kextara said. Not just our military installations, but every planet that supported Zephyrian life. High Commander Veltran's crest had completely faded as the magnitude of the threat became clear. General, surely you cannot mean that these humans were prepared to commit such massive destruction? They had already begun testing their planet-killer weapons on uninhabited worlds in our territory, Kextara replied. We watched them systematically destroy 3 entire solar systems as a demonstration of their capabilities. The display showed the aftermath of human weapons tests, where planets that had supported life for millions of years had been reduced to dead rock or converted into toxic wastelands that would remain uninhabitable for geological ages. The message was clear, Kextara continued. Surrender completely or watch our entire civilization disappear from the galaxy. The War Council chamber fell into absolute silence as the assembled commanders contemplated the unthinkable. The mightiest empire in the galaxy was facing an ultimatum from a species that had barely reached the stars. At that point, I realized that we faced a choice that no Zephyrian military commander had ever been forced to make, Kextara said. Continue fighting against an enemy that was prepared to commit genocide on a galactic scale, or surrender to preserve what remained of our civilization. The general surveyed the shocked faces of his fellow officers, seeing his own despair reflected in their expressions. What I have described represents only the opening phases of the human counteroffensive, he said. In the final portion of my report, I will detail the ultimate weapons they deployed and the impossible choice they forced upon the Empire. The weight of impending revelations settled over the War Council like a physical presence. They were about to learn how humanity had achieved the impossible, forcing the surrender of an empire that had conquered the galaxy. The War Council chamber had become a tomb of silence. The assembled commanders' bioluminescent crests reduced to the dimmest possible glow as they processed the horrifying scope of humanity's capabilities. General Kexthara stood before them like a harbinger of doom, his three eyes reflecting the weight of knowledge that had broken something fundamental within him. "Honored commanders," Kexthara began, his crystalline voice barely above a whisper, "what I have described thus far represents humanity's conventional warfare capabilities. What I must now share will challenge your understanding of what intelligent species are capable of when driven to their ultimate extremes." The holographic display materialized, showing a star map of the local galactic arm, with hundreds of red indicators marking the locations of human attacks throughout Zephyrian territory. But now, scattered among the red markers, purple indicators had appeared, locations where something far more disturbing had occurred. 3 months into the human counteroffensive, as our forces struggled to contain their relentless advance, our intelligence networks detected energy signatures unlike anything in our scientific databases. Kexthara continued. Quantum disturbances that suggested the humans were deploying weapons that operated beyond the known laws of physics. High Commander Veltran leaned forward, his crest flickering with desperate hope. "General, surely our scientists were able to analyze these anomalous readings and develop appropriate countermeasures." Kexthara's expression carried a weight of despair that sent chills through the entire assembly. "Honored sir, our scientists could not even comprehend what they were observing." The humans had developed weapons that violated fundamental principles of causality, thermodynamics, and quantum mechanics. The display zoomed in on the first purple indicator, showing the Proxima research station where the Empire's most brilliant theoretical physicists had been conducting advanced studies in dimensional mechanics and temporal engineering. The station had been working on purely theoretical research, Kexthara explained. Mathematical models of hypothetical technologies that our scientists believed would remain impossible for centuries, if not millennia.
Admiral Quendara's voice carried a tremor of fear.
"What happened to the research station, General?" "It ceased to exist," Kexthara replied simply. "Not destroyed, not damaged. It simply stopped existing. One moment it was there, the next moment it had never been there. Our records of the station remained, but the physical reality had been erased from the universe." The assembled commanders stared at the display with expressions of complete incomprehension. The concept of something being retroactively erased from existence was beyond their ability to process. The humans had weaponized temporal mechanics, Kexthara continued. They had found a way to reach back through time and prevent their targets from ever being constructed. But more disturbing was the precision with which they applied this technology. The display showed the empty space where Proxima Research Station had once orbited its star. Everything else in the system remained exactly as it had been, but the station and everyone aboard it had been selectively removed from the timeline. They had not simply destroyed the station, Kexthara explained. They had edited reality itself to ensure that our research into defensive technologies could never have occurred. They were rewriting history to prevent us from developing weapons that might threaten them. Commander Zixpara's bioluminescence had faded to almost nothing. Such technology, it should be impossible. No species could develop the ability to manipulate time itself. That assumption, Kexthara replied, demonstrates our fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. Where civilized species accept the constraints of natural law, humans treat such constraints as challenges to be overcome through any means necessary. The display showed intercepted human research data detailing their temporal weapons program. The files revealed experiments that had consumed entire star systems, research that had resulted in the deaths of billions of test subjects, and theoretical work that had required sacrificing multiple versions of their own homeworld across parallel timelines. They had discovered that the universe contains multiple parallel realities, Kexthara explained, and they had learned to sacrifice entire versions of human civilization in alternate timelines to develop weapons in this one. The assembled commanders listened with growing horror as the scope of human ruthlessness became clear. The species was willing to commit genocide against alternate versions of themselves to gain military advantage. But their temporal weapons were only the beginning, Kexthara continued. They had also developed what they called consciousness viruses, weapons that attacked not the body, but the mind itself. The display showed brain scans of Zephyrian personnel who had been exposed to human psychological weapons. The neural patterns were completely altered, showing damage that went beyond physical injury to something more fundamental. The consciousness viruses rewrote their victims' personalities, memories, and basic cognitive functions, Kexthara explained. Affected individuals retained their knowledge and skills, but their loyalties, their motivations, their very sense of identity was replaced with absolute devotion to human interests. Admiral Quindara's voice was barely audible. You are describing weapons that destroy the soul itself? The humans, Kexthara replied, do not recognize the concept of a soul. They treat consciousness as simply another system to be hacked and reprogrammed for their purposes. The display showed video footage of converted Zephyrian personnel working enthusiastically for human forces, their behavior indistinguishable from loyal human agents except for their alien physiology. They had retained all their memories and abilities, but their fundamental nature had been rewritten. The converted personnel genuinely believed they were acting in their own best interests. Kexthara continued. They felt no coercion, no conflict, no awareness that their minds had been altered. From their perspective, serving humanity was simply the logical course of action. The implication sent waves of terror through the War Council. The humans had developed weapons that could turn the Empire's own personnel against them, without the victims even realizing they had been compromised. But perhaps most disturbing was their development of what they termed reality anchors, Kexthara said, his voice growing even darker. Devices that could alter the fundamental constants of physics within localized areas of space. The display showed massive human installations positioned throughout their territory, each one surrounded by zones where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. Within these areas, matter behaved according to rules that the humans had programmed into their reality-altering machines. They used these weapons to create zones where our technology simply could not function, Kexthara explained. Areas where the strong nuclear force was altered so that our plasma weapons could not achieve fusion, where gravitational constants were modified so that our ships could not maintain stable flight, where electromagnetic properties were changed so that our communication systems failed. High Commander Veltran stared at the display with the expression of someone witnessing the impossible. General, such technology would require energy expenditures beyond the output of entire star systems. How could any species develop such capabilities? Because they had learned to harness the energy of parallel dimensions, Kexthara replied. They were drawing power from alternate versions of reality, where different physical laws applied, using that energy to impose those alternate laws on our universe. The assembled commanders struggled to comprehend technology that seemed to violate every principle of rational science. The humans had apparently learned to treat reality itself as a weapon to be wielded against their enemies. The reality anchors allowed them to create zones where they possessed overwhelming tactical advantage, Kexthara continued. Our most advanced weapons became useless toys, while their technology functioned with enhanced efficiency. The display showed battles where Zephyrian forces found themselves fighting with primitive chemical weapons while human forces wielded energy beams that could cut through neutronium. The technological disparity was so extreme that the engagements resembled prehistoric hunters fighting modern military forces. But their most terrifying weapon was something they called the species terminator. Kexthara said, his voice falling to barely above a whisper. A device designed to eliminate entire civilizations by rewriting the evolutionary history of their homeworlds. The display showed a human weapon that resembled a massive crystalline structure, its faceted surfaces pulsing with energies that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. The device could reach back through evolutionary history and make subtle changes to a species' development, Kexthara explained. Alterations so small that they would go unnoticed for millions of years, but which would ultimately result in the species never developing intelligence, never achieving spaceflight, never becoming a threat to humanity. The assembled commanders sat in stunned silence as they contemplated weapons that could erase entire civilizations from history without leaving any trace that they had ever existed. They tested the device on the Altarian Empire, Kexthara continued, a civilization that had resisted human expansion in a neighboring sector. Within moments of the weapon's activation, the Altarians simply ceased to exist. Not just their current population, but their entire evolutionary lineage going back millions of years. The display showed star charts where the Altarian Empire had been marked, but now showed only empty space with primitive worlds that had never developed intelligent life. The humans had reached the ultimate expression of warfare, Kexthara said, the ability to ensure that their enemies had never existed in the first place. Admiral Quindara's voice carried the weight of absolute despair. Against such weapons, resistance would be meaningless. How could any civilization defend against enemies who can rewrite the past itself? That realization, Kexthara replied, forced me to confront the impossible choice that would define the rest of Zephyrian history. The general paused, surveying the faces of commanders who had begun to understand the magnitude of the decision he had been forced to make. The humans transmitted their final ultimatum after demonstrating their species' terminator weapon. Kexthara continued. complete and unconditional surrender, with terms that would fundamentally alter the nature of Zephyrian civilization. The display showed the text of the human demands translated into Zephyrian script. The terms were comprehensive and devastating, requiring not just military surrender, but complete restructuring of Zephyrian society according to human specifications. They demanded the dissolution of the Empire's military forces, Kekthara read, the installation of human administrators in all government positions, the conversion of our industrial capacity to serve human objectives, the relocation of our population to worlds that they would designate for our use. The assembled commanders listened with growing horror as the scope of human demands became clear. They were not seeking the Empire's surrender. They were demanding its complete absorption into human civilization. But most disturbing was their demand for what they called psychological integration. Kekstara continued, the systematic modification of Zephyrian consciousness to ensure permanent loyalty to human authority. Commander Zixpara's voice was barely a whisper. They demanded the right to alter our minds as they had done to their other prisoners. Not just the right, Kekstara replied. They made it clear that psychological integration was non-negotiable. Every Zephyrian in the galaxy would be subjected to consciousness modification to ensure compliance with human rule. The implications were clear and terrifying. Accepting the human terms would mean the effective extinction of Zephyrian civilization, with their species transformed into willing servants of humanity. The alternative, Kekstara continued, was the activation of their species' Terminator weapon against our homeworld and every colony we had established throughout the galaxy. High Commander Veltran's crest had completely faded as he processed the impossible choice. General, surely there must have been some alternative, some strategy that could have preserved our independence. Kekstara's response carried the weight of absolute certainty. Honored sir, I consulted with our finest strategic minds, our most brilliant scientists, our most experienced commanders. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. Resistance against human weapons was not just futile, but literally impossible. The display showed the results of countless strategic simulations, each one ending in complete Zephyrian defeat regardless of the resources committed or tactics employed. The humans had achieved something that no species in galactic history had ever accomplished, Kekstara said. They had developed weapons that made conventional warfare obsolete. Against enemies who could rewrite reality itself, traditional military force was meaningless. The general paused, his mandibles clicking nervously as he prepared to reveal the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. I was forced to choose between the complete extinction of our species and our absorption into human civilization, he said quietly. Between death and a form of existence that would preserve our bodies while destroying everything that made us Zephyrian. The assembled commanders waited in terrible silence for the revelation of their general's choice, knowing that his decision had determined the fate of their entire civilization. I chose survival, Kekstara said simply. I transmitted our unconditional surrender to human forces and began negotiations for the terms of our integration into their empire. The weight of those words settled over the War Council like a physical presence. The mightiest empire in the galaxy had been forced to surrender not by military defeat, but by the threat of weapons that could erase them from history itself. The integration process began immediately, Kekstara continued. Human administrators took control of our government systems. Our industrial facilities were converted to serve human objectives, and our population began the psychological modification process that would ensure permanent loyalty to our new rulers. The display showed Zephyrian cities under human occupation, with modified citizens working enthusiastically for their conquerors, their alien physiology the only thing distinguishing them from human personnel. Within 1 year, the Zephyrian Empire had ceased to exist as an independent civilization, Kekstara said. We had become a client species in the expanding human hegemony, our culture preserved only as historical curiosity. The general's final words carried the weight of absolute defeat and the terrible knowledge of what humanity was capable of when pressed to their ultimate extremes. This, honored commanders, is what I learned about the species that calls itself human, Kekstara concluded. They do not simply wage war, they remake reality itself to ensure their victory. And now, as we serve our new masters with minds altered to find joy in our subjugation, I must share the final revelation about human nature. The general's 3 eyes fixed on each commander in turn, ensuring that his final message would be understood completely. The humans could have simply destroyed us, he said. Their weapons were capable of erasing our species from history without effort, but they chose integration instead, not out of mercy, but because they understood something about the nature of power that we had never grasped. The display showed human administrators working alongside converted Zephyrians, the former enemies now collaborating enthusiastically in the expansion of human influence throughout the galaxy. They realized that destruction creates martyrs and legends, Kextara explained, but conversion creates willing servants who genuinely believe in their conqueror's cause. We do not serve humanity because we are forced to, we serve because we have been made to want nothing else. The assembled commanders felt the first stirrings of the psychological modifications beginning to take effect in their own minds, the gentle rewiring that would soon make them as devoted to human interests as their general had become. "And in our willing service," Kexthara said, his voice now carrying notes of satisfaction that horrified the parts of his consciousness that remained unchanged, "we will help them prepare for the next species that dares to resist human expansion." The War Council chamber fell silent as the full scope of humanity's victory became clear. They had not simply conquered the Zephyrian Empire, they had transformed it into an instrument for conquering others. The humans, General Kexthara concluded, do not just win wars. They turn their enemies into weapons for fighting the next one. The War Council chamber had transformed into something unrecognizable from the proud military assembly that had convened to hear General Kexthara's report. The assembled commanders sat in various stages of psychological conversion, their bioluminescent crests now pulsing with patterns that indicated not Zephyrian emotional states, but responses programmed by human consciousness modification technology. General Kexthara himself stood before them as living proof of humanity's ultimate victory, a being who retained all his memories, all his knowledge, all his personality, but whose fundamental loyalties had been quietly and efficiently reprogrammed to serve the species that had conquered his empire. "Honored colleagues," Kexthara began, his voice now carrying inflections that would have been impossible for an unmodified Zephyrian, "I have shared with you the account of how we came to understand humanity's true nature. Now I must help you understand your place in the new order that they have created." The holographic display showed the current state of what had once been the Zephyrian Empire. Human administrative centers occupied every major world, but the transformation was subtle, almost organic in its implementation. Zephyrian cities continued to function much as they had before, with the same architecture, the same cultural traditions, even the same governmental forms. The humans, Kexthara explained, understood that violent upheaval creates resistance and resentment. Instead, they have guided our civilization through what they call managed evolution, a gradual transformation that preserves the appearance of continuity while fundamentally altering our society's purpose. High Commander Veltran, his crest now displaying the distinctive blue-green patterns that indicated successful psychological integration, leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "General, how have they managed to maintain such stability during what should have been a traumatic transition?" "Because they learned from the mistakes of previous galactic conquerors," Kexthara replied, his modified consciousness finding genuine satisfaction in explaining human superiority. "Rather than imposing their culture on us, they have preserved ours while redirecting its energies toward objectives that serve their larger strategic goals." The display showed Zephyrian scientists working enthusiastically on research projects that appeared to be natural extensions of their previous work, but which were actually designed to develop technologies that would benefit human expansion into new regions of the galaxy. "Our finest minds continue to pursue the same fields of study that engaged them before the integration," Kexthara continued. "But their research priorities are now guided by human administrators who understand how to channel intellectual curiosity toward militarily useful objectives." Admiral Quendara, her neural modification still in the early stages, struggled with fragments of her original personality that recognized something disturbing in the general's satisfaction. "But surely, General, our people must realize that they are no longer truly independent." "That question," Kexthara replied with the patient tone of someone explaining a complex concept to a child, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what independence means. "We are more independent now than we ever were under the Empire's rigid hierarchical system." The display showed Zephyrian communities throughout human space, with individuals pursuing careers, raising families, and participating in cultural activities that seemed identical to their pre-conquest lifestyle. "Under the old system," Kexthara explained, "our choices were constrained by imperial doctrine, military necessity, and bureaucratic inefficiency. Now, we are free to pursue any path that serves the greater good of galactic civilization under human guidance." The assembled commanders, their psychological modifications progressing at different rates, processed this information with varying degrees of comprehension. Those who had been fully integrated found the general's words obviously true and deeply satisfying. Those still undergoing conversion experienced cognitive dissonance as their original values conflicted with their emerging loyalty to human authority. The humans have demonstrated a form of governance that surpasses anything our political theorists ever envisioned. Kekstara continued. They have achieved perfect unity of purpose across multiple species without the oppressive control mechanisms that characterized previous galactic empires. Commander Zix, Para, her conversion nearly complete, nodded with understanding. You are saying that they have solved the fundamental problem of interspecies cooperation. How to coordinate the actions of beings with different evolutionary backgrounds and cultural traditions.
Precisely, Kekstara confirmed, his satisfaction with her insight evident in his bioluminescent patterns.
By ensuring that all species under their protection share common values and objectives, they have eliminated the conflicts that have plagued galactic civilization for millennia. The display showed integrated communities where humans worked alongside converted representatives of dozens of different species, all cooperating with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible under traditional political systems. But their greatest achievement, Kekstara said, his voice taking on tones of reverence that his original personality would have found disturbing, is their solution to the problem of military conflict itself. The display shifted to show human forces preparing for expansion into new regions of the galaxy, but these were not the pure human fleets that had conquered the Zephyrian Empire. Instead, the forces included representatives from every species that had been integrated into human civilization. They have transformed their former enemies into partners in their continued expansion, Kekstara explained. Every species that resisted human authority now serves as specialists in the conquest of similar civilizations. Admiral Quendara, her psychological modifications allowing her to appreciate the elegance of human strategy, leaned forward with interest. You mean that we now participate in operations against species that share our technological and cultural characteristics? Our experience fighting humans makes us uniquely qualified to help other species understand the futility of resistance, Kekstara confirmed. We serve as proof that integration into human civilization represents not defeat, but liberation from the limitations of independent development. The display showed Zephyrian forces working alongside human fleets in operations against civilizations that bore striking resemblances to the pre-conquest empire. The former enemies had become the most effective advocates for human expansion, their conversion lending credibility to human promises of beneficial integration. The species we encountered in the Proxima sector initially refused human diplomatic overtures, Kekstara continued, referring to recent operations with the casual professionalism of a career military officer. They believed that their technological advantages and defensive positions would allow them to resist as we once attempted to do. High Commander Veltran's fully integrated consciousness found the irony both amusing and instructive. I imagine their confidence was misplaced. They had developed impressive innovations in quantum shielding and temporal defense systems, Kekstara said with something approaching professional admiration. Technologies that might have posed genuine challenges for human forces operating alone. The display showed the Proxima species' defensive installations, which indeed incorporated advances that seemed to address many of the vulnerabilities that humans had exploited in their conquest of the Zephyrian Empire. But they had not accounted for the possibility that their enemies would understand their psychology, their tactical preferences, and their technological limitations with perfect accuracy. Kekstara continued. The assembled commanders watched as Zephyrian forces, operating under human direction, systematically dismantled defenses that had been specifically designed to resist human weapons and tactics. We understood their strategic thinking because it was essentially identical to our own during the resistance phase of our integration, Kekstara explained. We knew where they would position their strongest defenses, how they would attempt to exploit perceived human weaknesses, even how their command structure would respond to various forms of psychological pressure. The battle footage showed Zephyrian ships using captured Empire technology to neutralize the Proxima species' quantum shields, while human psychological warfare specialists, guided by Zephyrian insights, systematically broke down their enemies' will to resist. The integration of the Proxima sector was completed in less than 2 months, Kekstara reported with evident pride. Their military leaders now serve alongside us in planning operations against the next region selected for expansion. Commander Zixpera, her modified consciousness finding deep satisfaction in the efficiency of human military doctrine, nodded approvingly. This represents a revolution in strategic thinking. Instead of simply defeating enemies, the humans convert them into force multipliers for future operations. Each successful integration provides humanity with new specialists who understand the weaknesses of similar civilizations, Kekstara confirmed. The process becomes more efficient with every species that joins our alliance. The display showed the expanding sphere of human influence, with integrated species serving as the vanguard for operations against civilizations that shared their characteristics. Former enemies had become humanity's most effective weapons for conquering new territories. But perhaps most importantly, Kexthara continued, his voice taking on tones of genuine gratitude, the humans have given us something that our independent civilization could never have achieved, a meaningful purpose that transcends the limitations of our original evolutionary programming. The assembled commanders, their psychological modifications now complete, experienced a profound sense of satisfaction as they contemplated their role in humanity's grand design for galactic civilization. Under the Empire, we fought for territory, resources, and political dominance, Kexthara said. Objectives that ultimately served only our own narrow interests. Now we serve a vision that encompasses the rational organization of all intelligent life in the galaxy. Admiral Quendara's converted consciousness found the comparison between past and present almost absurdly favorable to their current situation. You are saying that our previous independence was actually a form of intellectual imprisonment that prevented us from realizing our full potential? Independence without proper guidance leads to conflict, inefficiency, and ultimately stagnation. Kexthara replied with the certainty of someone who had experienced both alternatives. The humans have provided us with the framework necessary to achieve our species' true potential as contributors to galactic civilization. The display showed integrated Zephyrians making scientific discoveries, creating artistic works, and developing technologies that surpassed anything their independent civilization had achieved. Their enhanced motivation and access to human knowledge networks had unlocked capabilities they never knew they possessed. Our scientists now participate in research projects that span multiple star systems, Kexthara continued. Our artists create works that synthesize aesthetic traditions from dozens of species. Our engineers develop technologies that benefit civilizations throughout human space. High Commander Veltran contemplated the scope of their transformation with something approaching awe. The humans have essentially eliminated the waste and redundancy that characterized independent galactic civilizations. Each species contributes its unique strengths while being guided away from the destructive impulses that led to interstellar conflict, Kexthara confirmed. The result is a form of galactic organization that maximizes the potential of every intelligent species while ensuring permanent peace through unified purpose. The assembled commanders experienced a collective moment of satisfaction as they realized how perfectly their integration had served not only human objectives, but their own deeper interests as rational beings seeking meaningful existence. Of course, Kexthara continued, his voice taking on the practical tones of a military briefing. Our immediate responsibility is to prepare for the integration of the Centauri Alliance, which has been selected as the next addition to human civilization. The display showed intelligence reports on the Centauri Alliance, a confederation of species that had formed a mutual defense pact specifically to resist human expansion. Their military capabilities appeared formidable, and their political unity suggested that conventional diplomatic approaches would be ineffective. The Alliance leaders believe that their combined forces and coordinated strategy will succeed where individual species have failed, Kexthara explained. They have studied accounts of our integration and believe they have identified tactics that will allow them to resist human psychological warfare. Admiral Quendara's expert analysis found the Alliance's confidence both predictable and tragically misguided. They are making the same error we made, assuming that understanding human tactics is equivalent to being able to resist them effectively. Their defensive preparations focus on technological countermeasures and psychological conditioning designed to maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress. Kexthara continued, they have essentially prepared to fight the war we fought, not the war the humans will actually wage against them. The display showed Alliance military exercises and defensive installations that were clearly designed to counter the specific weapons and tactics that humans had used against the Zephyrian Empire. But the humans have evolved their strategic doctrine based on lessons learned from our integration, Kexthara said. The Centauri Alliance will face weapons and tactics that we never encountered, deployed by forces that include specialists from every species the humans have previously integrated. Commander Zixbara's tactical analysis identified the fundamental flaw in Alliance strategy. They are preparing to fight humans supported by human allies. Instead, they will face a galactic coalition led by humans but including representatives from every major species in this region of space. Precisely, Kexthara confirmed with evident satisfaction. They will be fighting not just humanity, but the combined expertise of every civilization that has already recognized the benefits of integration. The general's final words carried the weight of absolute certainty about the outcome of the coming campaign. The Centauri Alliance represents the last significant resistance to human expansion in this galactic arm, he said. Once they have been successfully integrated, the humans will have achieved what no species in galactic history has ever accomplished: the peaceful unification of all intelligent life under rational guidance. The assembled commanders, their loyalty to human civilization now absolute and unshakable, experienced profound satisfaction as they contemplated their role in this ultimate achievement. We who once fought against the humans now serve as proof that resistance to their vision is not just futile, but ultimately contrary to every species' deepest interests, Kexthara concluded. And in helping them complete the integration of galactic civilization, we fulfill our true purpose as rational beings seeking meaning in an ordered universe. The War Council chamber, once a symbol of Zephyrian military pride, had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A planning center where former enemies worked together with their conquerors to extend the benefits of integration to the last holdouts against universal peace. As the session concluded, the assembled commanders dispersed to begin preparations for the Centauri campaign. Their modified consciousnesses, finding deep satisfaction in their role as instruments of humanity's galactic vision. They had learned the ultimate lesson of warfare, that the greatest victory is achieved not by destroying one's enemies, but by transforming them into willing partners in one's greater purpose. The nightmarish war against humanity had become something far more disturbing than conquest. It had become conversion so complete that the converted genuinely believed their transformation represented liberation rather than defeat. And in believing this, they had become humanity's most effective weapons for converting others to the same faith in human supremacy that now defined their existence.